What if I were to tell you that you are not who you think you are? That we are not the physical beings that we've been led to believe? What if I were to tell you that you've been living in a simulation? That the reality that we experience is not really the real world? It's just a dream.
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
Hi, my name is Thibaut, and I make videos on philosophy, science, and pretty much whatever topic intrigues me around the time of recording. Today's episode is going to be about consciousness, the self, and why reality isn't all it seems. Right off the bat, I just want to say this. This is not going to be a video on how reality is running on a giant supercomputer, and how all of human consciousness is actually just the product of some otherworldly simulation. No, I value your intellect far too much for that. Instead, what we're going to be discussing here is something far more profound, on why conscious experience is really just simulated experience. That might seem a little confusing. I thought you just said that we weren't living in a simulation. We are, just maybe not the kind that you were thinking of. What is the self? In my last video, I mentioned that the self is part of a story describing how an organism behaved over time. Now, that answer might seem a little esoteric at first, but hopefully by the end of this video, this should start making a lot more sense. The self is who you are as a person. It's your identity. I myself am Thibaut. I'm 27 years old. I was born in the UK to a French mother and an English father, and since the age of 6, I've mostly been living in France. This is the story of who I am as a person, but it's just that, a story. Fundamentally, you and I are both made up of cells, right? Tiny little cells interacting with one another according to the laws of biochemistry. But we don't get to see reality at that level of detail. We don't get to see what every cell in our body gets up to. What we see is the emergent behavior of the aggregate. We see the collection of cells as a whole. It's really important that we understand this before we move on. We don't get to see reality as it is fundamentally. We only get to see it at a certain degree of resolution. Take this picture, for example. This painting is part of a series of optical illusions by British artist Wagstaff. When we look at it from a certain distance, we can quite clearly make out the image of a woman's face. But when we begin zooming in on the picture, we start losing sense of what the overall image meant. Now all that we see is a bunch of lines. Reality is a lot like that. When we start zooming in on reality, things start ceasing to make sense. Let's imagine that we're playing a video game. Let's say Mario, for example. In this game, there are no real blocks, right? Our character isn't actually physically hitting anything. The blocks in the video game are just a 3D model of something that you or I might see in the real world. They are coded for by an underlying bunch of zeros and ones. The blocks that we are seeing on the screen are just a visual representation that helps serve the aesthetics of the game. It's part of the game's UI. It makes it easier for the player to interact with the game. And it's a similar thing for you and I. There is this entity that is playing a game. Let's call this the game of life. As this being goes around playing the game, it develops models of the world around it. This right here is a banana. That right there is a mug. But fundamentally, there is no such thing as a banana or a mug, right? When you break these things down, underneath you see that it's all just a bunch of atoms. There is no platonic form of the banana. These objects that we see are given rise to by a much more fundamental substrate of reality, a physical reality, a world of elementary particles. It's just that this world makes no sense to us. It's not written in a language that we can understand. But just as a person playing Mario doesn't need to see the underlying lines of code when his character hits a block, we don't need to see the potassium and glucose in a banana to know that we can eat it. The banana is just a mental abstraction of something far more complex than we can see, but it helps serve the game's aesthetics, the game's UI. It's a model of reality that makes it easier for the player to interact with the game, and the player sees the game at a resolution which is sufficient for it to function, to play the game. Some of these models, our player learns, have the ability to act in the world. Birds have the ability to fly, dogs have the ability to bark and bite. Those are a special kind of model that our player learns to view as agents. Agents are special because they have the ability to affect their will on the world. They are far less predictable than other kinds of models. They can act in the world based on their motivations and intents. As our entity continues to interact with the world, it starts noticing that there is one agent in particular which seems super special, as this agent seems to be acting in coordination with the being's own thoughts. When the player thinks about moving his arm, the agent moves his arm. When it thinks about taking a sip from the cup, the agent brings the cup to its lips. And so this entity begins identifying as the agent that is performing those actions. Essentially, the player begins identifying as the character on the screen. In the words of AI researcher and cognitive scientist Joscha Bach, the self is the first-person model of one's own agency. But it's just that, a model. It's not real in any fundamental sense of the term. At the risk of repeating myself here, let's just go over this one more time. There is an organism that is acting in the world. This world is written in a language that the organism does not and cannot understand. And so it dreams up a mental representation of the world, an abstraction of reality, in order to better understand how to act. In this mental realm, there are models that help serve the game's aesthetics, that help make for a more coherent narrative. And one of those models is the organism's own mental representation of itself, the self. You and I are not the organism. We are mental representations that the organism has dreamed up about itself. Essentially, we are not the person that is playing the game. We're more like the character that pops up on the screen. I'm just going to cut to a quote by Fernando Pessoa here, because as much as I'd love just hammering in this one idea, there's only so much that our brains can digest before they all start turning to mush.
In all your real life actions from the day you are born until the day you die, it is not you performing those actions. You do not live. You are merely lived.
The world that you and I inhabit is not the real world. It is a dream world. The real world is made up of things like quarks, gluons, and electrons. We don't get to see this fundamental substrate of reality. We don't get to see the underlying zeros and ones. Our experience of reality is an approximation of reality. It's the best that our brains can do given their limited processing power. We only get to see reality at a certain degree of resolution, but this resolution is sufficient for the organism to function, to play the game. Our conscious experience is a dreamed reality. It is a simulated experience. Fundamentally, there is no agent. When we zoom in on the agent, we see that it's actually just an organism made up of countless individual cells. And when we zoom in on those cells, we notice that they are really just a bunch of complex organic molecules. And if we zoom in on those molecules, we realize that they themselves are composed of these tiny elementary particles. Physical reality is written in a language that we do not experience. The reality that we experience does not exist in any fundamental sense. It only exists as a representation of something real. By extension, the selves that we experience ourselves as being only exist as a model of something real. The pain, the love, the color, the sound, none of these exist in any fundamental sense of the term. We are not the organism. We are merely part of a story that the organism has dreamed up about itself. Once again, I'm going to leave this one up to Pessoa.
I don't know what my ideas are, or my feelings, or my character. If I do feel something, I feel it in the visualized person of some creature who appears inside me. I have replaced myself with my dreams, and each person is merely his dream of himself. I am not even that.
My name is Thibault. I was born in the UK to a French mother and an English father, and since the age of 6 I've mostly been living in France. Since as long as I can remember, I have always been passionate about philosophy and science, and now I make videos on those subjects up here on YouTube. This is the story of who I am, but it's just that, a story. None of it exists in any fundamental sense. You can't zoom in on any cell in my body and expect to see the name Thibaut written anywhere. You can't zoom in on a map of France and expect to see the letters France spelled out in the blades of grass. These concepts are all fictional. They are made up. They're just stories. And that's what makes our reality so beautiful. The fact that deep down, none of this actually makes any sense. It's all just part of a dream. The beauty of conscious experience is precisely that it is not real, at least not in any fundamental sense. You can make of your life whatever you want it to be. There are no rules. You just make up the story as you go along. When I was a kid, my passion for cosmology and physics led me to develop a pretty nihilistic take on life. Early on, I just had this sense that nothing in life truly mattered. When you look at it from a cosmological point of view, the universe is just one massive horde of particles haphazardly interacting with one another according to the fundamental laws of physics. Deep down, nothing that ever happens truly has any meaning. As a kid, I saw myself as detached from myself, that events in life were already scripted, and that I was just a passenger observing the unfolding of these events.
Seeing the immanent futility of all forms of action was from childhood on one of my favorite means of detaching myself even from myself.
I understand now how dark a take on life that might seem for a pre-adolescent. But the fact is, I actually saw the beauty in that. I found beauty in the absurdity of it all. To think that this world, which was fundamentally void of all meaning, could bring about this. Our lives, our conscious experience, so rich and vivid. That a chaotic pool of quantum fluctuations could give rise to entities acutely aware of their own existence. This is a facet of our world which never ceases to amaze me. As James Gleick recounts in his masterful work Chaos, how a purposeless flow of energy can wash life and consciousness into the world. I love dreaming. I love living in a dream. But I'm also very curious of what this fundamental reality might be. To understand the underlying mechanisms behind this dream, so that I may one day hope to escape from this inalienable perspective that I've grown so accustomed to. All so that I may remind myself never to take this dream for granted.
For I am not merely a dreamer. I am exclusively a dreamer.
I guess ultimately my intention with this channel is this, to share in this childish amazement of the world, to share in this awe. I'm currently working on a follow-up essay to this one, on the absurdity of life, on how to survive in a world without meaning. So if you enjoyed this video and you're eager for more, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay smart, most importantly, stay curious.